Okay.
Yeah, I mentioned that he just found talking to you really helpful. And I'd sort of had a vague intention to chat with you for a while. I think we chatted once like a long, long time ago. It was like
I was
2 years ago or something.
Trying to remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. So a combination of, vague intention and then the progress I've made in the meantime, it's like there's fewer people to get complex feedback from. You know, according to most people I talk to, it's like, well, you're already doing all the things. I don't know. So I thought it could be valuable. And then for myself, and then clarification of concepts, you know, despite all the problems with concepts, the normative stickiness of concepts. Obviously, we're both, what would I call it? Concept cosmonauts of some sort. Which can be a benefit to other people as well.
Absolutely.
Increases legibility.
Yeah, one of the reasons I wanted to record is that it might produce a lot of value that can be shared with other people. So we might spend our time just kind of feeling each other out, or it'll like produce a lot of cool stuff. Who knows? We'll find out. Okay. Yeah.
So for myself, so I tend towards the Theravada map, which I think you have your disagreements with. Actually, I don't think we've ever fully cracked on what the disagreements are. It's something like the ontological, conceptual, like ways of thinking about it, which I think that those, I'm kind of a shrug on those too, like in the sense that the most dramatic thing for me about them was just there was a clear before and after, in the sense of before certain events that bore some resemblance to descriptions, a certain set of descriptions. They're like, oh, this is first path stuff. And it was like, well, it was like a bunch of poetic, crazy weirdness, right? And it's like, okay, I kind of can grasp it, but everyone's saying different things. And then after these events, it was like, oh, no, it's very obvious what they're talking about. In fact, it's obvious that they're all talking about the same object in different ways, and they're using a lot of metaphors and poetic language. And oh, I would not quite put it that way, or you know, this one I don't quite agree with. But there was clearly a there afterwards. And then Keegan levels as well, in the sense of Keegan is originally predicated on the sentence structure changes, so the way people talk about certain things. That seemed distinct as well for a similar reason, right? Is like the way that these things are talking about something. It's like, oh, it starts making sense. I've since used it for diagnostic for others as well, and I think it's somewhat reliable. I don't think it's like extremely reliable, but my gut check intuition is that, yeah, there's specific things that when people talk about them, the way they talk about them changes with certain milestones. So anyway, that said, I typically use it as a guide. And the area that I'm in now, working with sort of like non-dual stuff, is significantly less conceptual. Like, it's something like first and second path in the Theravada map are sort of highly cognitive in nature. They involve the way the mind thinks about itself in a lot of ways. Is that right? There's other components too, but that's a decent chunk of it. And that you can sort of just do. You can sort of just like hammer down, just go ahead and like meditate a ton, do some analytic inquiry, whatever's necessary, talk to teachers, figure out what practices resonate, and just like do it. And yeah, the school I was originally in was like, yeah, 6 months to 3 years, you know, first milestone, they have a different map, but it's clearly some isomorphisms. 6 months to 3 years, like, yeah. And that, from what I can tell, took 2.5 years for me. So it's like, yep, this all kind of makes sense. And then it also makes sense to me now that when the Theravadins talk about third path, like Theravadins mostly don't make it to the third path, or like the ones that do. There's often a lot of school switching going on, or a lot of starting to bring in tantric or vajrayana practices, like, because at that point it's basically the cognitive stuff for first and second path. It's like you don't really need to clean up your life to do that. You can sort of just like blast straight through. And then third path stuff, it's like, nope, everything has to come along for this stuff. Like you've got to clean up all of your mundane life stuff, all of your like emotional stuff, physical stuff too, like even just like noticing what's going on with the body. And raising the energy volume ultimately, which is sort of states that are similar, have a lot of similarities to psychedelics in my experience. So yeah, there's like methodological plurality that seems to like come in at this stage. So yeah, I've been making some progress. It's harder to talk about this area of progress. Some of the things that I just mentioned are things that I only came to after sitting with it, thinking about it for a while, having some experiences. But yeah, so you have less of a distinct phase model.
That's right.
And more like there's a bunch of stuff going on at the low level. You need to investigate a significant fraction of it at some point. Like, yeah, I just wondered what you think about, yeah, how would I diff this stuff?
I have ideas. I have ideas, or
yeah, great.
If the way that I start talking still isn't quite where you want to go, just keep going. Cut me off and just keep going, because the things you said were very helpful for setting context. It seems like we're like decently on the same page. I think so. I sort of look at like the practice of insight maps as sort of, you know, one-dimensional maps that are sort of a low dimensionality projection onto like a thing, maybe kind of cutting off the top unclear, but like you know, like obviously like correlated with reality. Ditto for like the Keegan stuff. And so, and I'll just note that one of the things that got me back into meditation was I was doing practices that I did not conceive of as meditation, but I really clearly realized I was cycling after kind of the second cycle. And I was like, and that's when I went all in on meditation again. I was like, oh, okay, well, I should just do meditations of whatever the fuck I've been doing, you know, whatever this is that's still causing meditation-y cycling. I only obviously cycled a couple times, and then that just all went away when I switched what I was doing. But I'm very grateful to Ingram for being like, probably the real thing. It happens. So I'll just note that. So I really liked what you said about sort of eventually want us to like bring everything in. That indeed kind of is like sort of my shtick, my deal. And I look at the sort of more contemporary and past like Theravada and stuff as kind of like depth first, to use kind of a computer science analogy. And you're right, like you can kind of like power along in a straight line. You don't need like too much slack in the system. You need a little bit, but like you can just, a lot of people can just kind of go, kind of produce effects, kind of get a bunch of stuff. And often it's like quite destabilizing. And I think like from a distance, like I don't have a lot of numbers. I haven't had a lot of discussions with people, but just the way people talk about it, it seems like it can be quite destabilizing. And as far as I can tell, eventually like the system kind of runs out of slack, as if something's like getting pulled tight. And then eventually you sort of have to go and do a bunch of other stuff to continue making progress. So I think we agree on that, and that's like pretty cool. So let's see. I sort of, to use the computer science analogy some more, I sort of look at my stuff as breadth first. And so I think there's pluses and minuses to both approaches. And so with the depth first stuff, it's like a little bit easier to get started. It's a little bit easier to tell something's happening. And the negative is like a bit more destabilizing. So with my stuff, like if one doesn't have like a good sort of compass and map, and one isn't kind of like hewing to like good conceptual, you know, distinctions and things, I think it is possible to kind of get sort of like swimmy. but like if one, as far as I can tell, if one practices tightly with my stuff, one can go all the way, but with some diminished degree of like destabilization, whatever. So it's like my bet, it's my hope that like my stuff is like sort of safer. And the other piece of it is sort of the comprehensiveness. Like right off the bat, with my stuff, one is intended to bring in whatever is necessary to kind of, touch all the things that need to be touched. So like one of the reasons that I think noting works when it does work is because it can sort of like actuate like all of the levers that like need to be actuated, because it's so incredibly sort of like general. And so it's like, so if a person keeps doing it, they're more likely than when using some systems to like kind of do everything that's necessary to do. And so I often tell people, like, if you don't want to deal with my stuff, if it's too complicated, just take one piece, like the meta protocol, which is like the wayfinding component, or one of the wayfinding components, and then do noting. So anyway, yeah, so like my main practice P2 is intended to be a container for like sort of every possible actuator, every possible lever, or every possible degree of freedom that one can do, where each thing that they do somehow changes the state of the system. And you just stack those, the combination like a million, like actions long, that will sort of unlock like the whole thing. And then the preliminary auxiliary practices are intended to just be an ad hoc, messy at the moment list of continually aggregating all the degrees of freedom a person might exercise to kind of make progress. The idea being, like, you do some sort of sensory motor operation, the system receives feedback, the system changes a little bit, and you just stack those in like a massively long chain. Yeah, so like with respect to sort of where you might be at, I think what tends to happen, kind of as you said, like a lot of people who start out with more of the classical stuff maybe kind of get stuck at some point, or like seem to stop making progress. And so, so the thing that I sort of push is like global wayfinding, which is essentially sort of taking total sovereignty over one's own progress, by sort of explicitly looking at the feedback loops that they're using to determine what progress is, to like sort of self-reconceptualize what progress is for themselves, and to be continually upgrading the feedback loops that they're using, as well as what their conception is of like what they're supposed to be doing and where they're supposed to be going, which eventually involves like releasing, any conceptualization of that at all. So yeah, so like, I typically suggest to people that when at some point, like, they start using something like a meta protocol, something like explicit engagement with feedback loops, as well as a practice that has like a hole in it, or like an unbound variable, so that they can keep putting things into, loading things into that variable, but then they still have like a framework that allows them to be like very like contiguous in their practice. So it's so they have a crank that they can keep turning, but the crank is general enough that they can keep loading things into, the gearbox or whatever. And I think that allows someone to make pretty efficient progress, even in such like a vast, like amorphous, nebulous space. And what eventually happens is, like, after a person gets stuck, 20, 30, 40, 50 times, 60 times, 100 times, and either by reading a book or going down like a list of, auxiliary practices, or like talking to the people, then finding like new degrees of freedom that they're missing, the system kind of gets like sort of like an omnidirectional generativity, And so the system itself can then start to, like, almost without fail, like, invent like the next thing that it needs to do to sort of generate the right operations, inverse operations, to like properly backtrack and refine and re-wayfind and whatever. And then like this like P2 thing becomes like more and more fine-grained. It actually starts to look a lot like noting again, because it's extremely fine-grained and extremely subtle and sometimes extremely fast. And yeah, and then you just sort of go. And like the what my experience is, and with myself and like a few other people, small n still, is that like the degree of like certainty of the both like the effectiveness of what one is doing as well as the inexorability and inevitability of it, it's like the feedback loops get so good that like in the mid-range it's like one is making like month-long bets that they think they're sort of doing the right thing and it's like going to work, and then like at some point like you just get so confident, and so then you just put in the time and just like uh so like there's just, at least in my experience, for whatever it's worth, like there's no sense of like, oh, am I doing it right, is this actually going to work, like it's just like it's gonna happen. And like the phenomenology of it is like the knots, the twists, the whatever, just really systematically they just keep undoing themselves. So it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, so I think actually from that I think there's more overlap in how we think about this than I thought previously. So I'd say that I usually diagnose and think about things similarly. The difference is I hew like a little bit, I hew closer to, like, I restrict more degrees of freedom. I'm like, yes, there's like this crank, but like, let's go with the crank that the Buddha outlined, or like at least loosely. Where the what I'm claiming that one is the threefold training. It seems neglected in my estimation, I guess I would say. So very similar to Shinzen's concentration, clarity, and equanimity, where he's talking about the results of practice. I say the same things, but I tend to talk about the methods. So like each slot is modular, right? Like you can make sort of similarly like bets on methods. Like you can try things out on the week or month level of granularity and see what it's doing, give it enough time to see what it's doing, and then swap things out if they start to stagnate, or if that step becomes not spinning out, like spinning down versus spinning up, right? I think you go through these phases where it's like you get a nice combination that's working really well, you get spinning up really nicely, and then
it cut out for a second. I heard
the opposite. Really well. It spins back down and you tinker. Yeah, spins up really well, and then also the opposite. So it spins back down and then you tinker, right? And let's swap out one of the practices in one of the areas.
Yeah. So a few things that I would mention are, if I'm understanding you correctly, like I'm familiar with the experience of like kind of getting something that's working, and then you just sort of keep pushing the button, and it's like you're sort of like up, and it's like really obvious that like useful things are happening. One thing that so 2 points that I would make are, there's sort of a way to, in my opinion, and you might 100% agree, like kind of transcend method, where one is not applying a method, or one is not applying sort of an abstraction, where like one is like doing insight practice or doing concentration, and then within that doing, like of course like there's some modulation and nuance and whatever, but one is still sort of like blockily conceiving as such. This is a straw, of course, blockily conceiving as such that like they're doing a particular practice. I think what can happen is that there's something like radical concreteness, or like radical contact with the territory, where one is not sort of doing a practice conceptualized as such, but one is simply like manipulating the territory, or just doing what needs to be done in a specific and concrete and detailed way, like to the body mind system. And so that's, it's like you have tweezers and you're, sort of moving things around. as opposed to, you know, kind of like concentration move or like insight move, and that's totally a straw. But like one of the things that I want to impress upon people has to eventually not be like, all right, you know, I'm doing practice X, but one has to eventually be like, exactly what is happening, and what should be happening instead, and what exactly manipulations do I exactly do to, you know, exactly continue to resculpt the system. Um, and that's like a little bit sort of too top down. You know, it's felt and sensuous and intuitive, and one has to like surrender and go into reverie and daydream, and let go. But the like extraordinary sort of eventual precision, and concreteness, I think, is like really, really important to eventually impress upon people. Um, and then the other piece, part two, is that I'm really sort of I tend to like warn people away from something like the experience of momentum. I have like this list in my head of something like, rushing, haste, hurrying, forcing, overriding, bypassing. So it's like whenever there's sort of a flywheel spinning, as it were, or like really feels like kind of something's going, even when good things are happening, often like there will be like subtle errors or like subtle error propagation. And so like eventually one is sort of, you know, just making precise moves and like taking back precise things. But like one is not sort of dragging a bunch of like the system along with them, you know, according to like some hypothesis of like what the right thing to do is, where, you know, just like a lot of like messy changes are kind of getting pulled along. Like eventually, you know, there's like pristine perfection, something like, you know, it's bad to sort of, you know, reify that. That's like not real, blah, blah, blah. But like, just the concreteness, the precision, the smoothness, you know. So like if someone is like, yeah, it's like working, and again, not, you know, then like, yeah, like probably it's like net beneficial, but also like there's like something better to be doing eventually when one is actually able to kind of get that smoothness and sort of starting and stopping on a dime and precision and whatever. And again, and the precision isn't tight. It's like flowing and effortless and costless and whatever, but you know, over time. So,
yeah. So I think about let's see, there's a few things. The first one is Upaya. So there's two ways that it shows up for me. The first is sort of what I would call within the box, which is that on the insight part of the cycle, right? So coming out of concentration and you're like, oh, the mind's in a great position for insight. There are specific insight techniques, and I see those as kind of like oftentimes like sharpening a blade or something. And then there's also just Upaya, like the mind intuitively like dropping technique and actually doing exactly what you're saying. So like wait, what's happening? Like carefully following. The way it shows up for me often is upon emerging from a concentrated state, relatively concentrated state. There's just whatever's arising, right? Sensory experience is arising, and just like carefully following over it like multiple times. Just like, okay, fantasizing is happening, or aversion is happening, or something is happening, and just like very careful, just like watching. So that's sort of within paradigm, right? It's like, oh yeah, of course, that's exactly what they say in the texts. And then there's a sort of more outside context where like you do all of these things within the paradigm or within the context or whatever. And then there's this like softening or like backgrounding of all of it. It's like, okay, I did all those things. They did something to the mind, and then just like dropping all of it. And again, attending to whatever's happening with the analytic knowledge, not in the moment because you're just dropping it, but looking at that experience as a thing that occurs multiple times, noticing, oh yeah, okay, so by bringing these things forward and then dropping them, they're still like nearby. And it's sort of like all the Dhamma factors, like not just concentration. So like in the Rob Burbea sense of like different ways of seeing, it's like you bring up this lens very explicitly and then you drop it. And it's like, yes, but that's still coloring. There's still some like overlay. And the cool thing is that you get combinations of these overlays, and sometimes they really cause something to sort of click or like unmake itself or fall apart in your hands in a nice way.
Definitely.
And then the other piece is around the haste. I think I might venture that it's something like if you get a flywheel spinning up, you are in fact doing conditioning. Which you're just going to have to undo, which is fine. Like it can be temporarily useful. And we're ideally looking for, you know, the right conditioning. I hear what you're saying in the sense of like, yeah, but don't see it as like find the right grooves and then like dig them really deep. Like that's not necessarily the way.
Right. So yeah, I guess there's two pieces. Well, I guess it kind of dovetails. So I'm going to use this word. I'm sure I'm going to use this word incorrectly, but I'm going to use the word karma. Let's just assume that I'm using some weird bullshit concept that I'm applying that word to it. But like the point that I want to make is that like everything a person does is either like adding structure or removing structure. That's not quite right either. But like when a person is, you know, sort of making a move, it's either going to add inappropriate structure, remove inappropriate structure, or a combination of the two. And so like I want to like make a point of something like nothing is costless. So like person is like, you know, like I'll try this like practice a little bit. It's like that is laying down conditioning, unless it's not. And so like and if it is laying down conditioning, then at some point in the future that person will need to find their way back to like that place in the state space and sort of undo that conditioning if they want to just sort of keep going without bound. So like I certainly don't want to cause people to be you know scrupulous or like too tense or stressed about experimenting is key. It's like so important. Creativity, yes, but like everything a person does is going to, you know, alter the system in a way that may or may not have to be undone at some point. And if they spend 10 minutes doing it, they will need to do some fraction of 10 minutes undoing it somewhere if there's something problematic. So you know, I'm gonna, you know, this might end up like online somewhere, but like these aren't the kinds of things that I would say to someone beginning, because in the beginning, you know, you explore, you do crazy shit, like you exercise all the degrees of freedom in the system you can find, and then eventually when someone's more advanced, like they do learn like a sort of scrupulosity, but it's like not there's like nothing on top of it, like they're not stressing themselves out about, you know, making mistakes. Like that is also sort of like released. And like, you know, it's also worth noting that there's an interesting sense in which the mind is lossless. So like, you know, that part of why it takes like 10,000 hours is part of it is just sort of the raw time the system needs to change in real time for like synapses and whatever they're doing. But the other thing is that tons and tons of error propagation is occurring. And so the system has to eventually go back and like fix like all the errors that they propagated in trying to, you know, become enlightened or whatever in the first place. And that takes time too. And so the important thing is that, you know, the mind, there is a particular way in which the mind is lossless. So like, because of like Buddha mind or Buddha nature or whatever, any crazy error the system makes in trying to like self-modify, like can eventually be undone. And then you get like Buddha nature or not the natural state or like whatever. So on the one hand, I want to like impress upon people like there's sort of like only one path or like only one like unraveling, but maybe partial ordering, but also like you have, you know, all things being equal, like infinite redos. Like any mistake you make, you can unravel eventually. Sometimes the system has to make some changes to learn how to unravel a particular thing, but yeah. So losslessness or infinite redos or recoverability, but also like the extreme like precision of the unraveling that needs to occur is like also something I want to impress on like advanced meditators. So,
yeah. So I think we do have a slight difference here. So the breadth first versus depth first. I view it as, I view the claims around maps that like, and commentaries on suttas and stuff about like what practice should look like as essentially claims that it's like, look, okay, there's lots and lots of ways up the mountain. And you do in fact need to condition yourself. Like you will condition yourself in the context of doing this because that's all you know how to do initially, until you start getting the unconditioning going. But there are things that people have discovered where it's like this type of conditioning has nice properties. Like it's almost like knots that are meant to be undone versus ones that aren't. Like the ones that have the quick release, right? Oh, it lost for a second.
I lost maybe a tiny piece of what you say. So knots that are meant to be undone and knots that aren't?
Yeah. So you know those knots that have a quick release, like you can pull one part of the knot and it just comes undone. So I see Dhamma factors as essentially like that. Like it's not that these things are not conditioning and not fabricated. It's that they're fabrications that have a bunch of nice properties and they're general purpose tools for undoing a bunch of other fabrications. So specifically,
those eventually get, sorry, do you believe that those eventually get undone themselves, or do you think those stick around forever?
I think my belief right now, the majority of my probability mass is on the Theravada map points to conditioning all the way up to third path, and fourth path is undoing all of that conditioning. So the conditioning is essentially, we have the Brahmavihara Sutta where the Buddha says something like, they come to him and they ask him about Brahmavihara practice, because this predates the Buddha and also like lots of other extant schools at the time where we're doing variations that were like very clearly the same thing. So like people find Brahmavihara practice intuitive. It seems that different schools converge on the same similar set of practices. And they're like, what's the deal? Like you also say they're good. Like, how does this work? And he says, oh yeah, that'll get you to third path. Like just straightforwardly. It's not even a very long sutta. He's like, yeah, that'll get you to fourth path or third path. He says, if you don't have insights along with it, you'll still be stuck. Mm-hmm. And I interpret that in the sort of the framework that we're talking about actually makes sense for this, right? It's like, if you don't ever realize that this itself is also just conditioning and fabricated, then you'll wind up kind of stuck there too. It's a good place to be stuck. He like says, like, it's like the heavenly abode, something. But yeah, still stuck. So he says, but Brahmaviharas plus insights, specifically like insights into the three characteristics in like the five skandhas, for instance, you'll unmake those and you're good to go. So yeah, and what else do I have to say about that? Twim, Brahmaviharas. I think that covers it. I think that covers the.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's something. Yeah. Okay. I think there's something weird going on. So my disagreement is something like, if someone spends, you know, 2 to 20 years like becoming like a concentration person, 2 to 20 years like doing tons and tons of sort of Brahmavihara type practices, it's going to take, like, that's going to sort of do something that I call like layering, where just I don't know if like I want to make emphasize like the degree of like layering that can occur, where it's going to take the mind to, all things being equal, 20 minutes to like 20 years to sort of like run out of slack. But like eventually those practices are going to cause like self-suppression, behavioral rigidity, difficulty making further changes, fewer degrees of freedom to construct like inverse operations to kind of undo some of those things. So it's like it can just lay down like so much structure that is like not necessarily in the person's best interest. Not, I could be overstating this. Like I haven't spent a lot of time around people who do a ton of these practices, but this is like my current provisional position. And so like if someone spends like 20,000 hours, that's way too much. Someone spends 2,000 hours doing like particular Brahmavihara practice, they're going to have to spend some fraction of 2,000 hours, I'm guessing somewhere between 200 hours and or 2,000 hours, like applying like an inverse operation to that, because there's just going to be a way in which it's like maybe locally useful but like globally incorrect. And like uh, and then let's see. With respect to sort of this idea of knots that are like meant to be undone and knots that are not meant to be undone, like I want to make a distinction between conditioning, something like conditioning and structure, where once all of the knots are sort of undone, let's say you undo all the knots, um, uh, there is fluidity, but fluidity is not arbitrariness. There is still structure. It's structural fluidity. So like the system, still has sort of behaviors and preferences, and coherence, and sensitive responsivity. But the system also has an ability to kind of fit the shape of its environment, like water filling a container, no matter what shape the container is in. So it's like, there's still a personality there. It's like, yeah, that's Bob, and he's acting like Bob. Um, you know, but Bob will change quite a bit over time if Bob is an advanced meditator. Um, so I would guess something like you really, 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 really want to undo all the knots eventually. But then there's still structure. It's not, you don't just become a blob, or like, melted water or something. It's liquid, but it's like structured liquid. Um, but we might be using the word knots differently, or yeah.
So yeah, I think the way I'm interpreting what you're saying, I think it highlights for me that I might be taking for granted like the high openness, low neuroticism cluster, which is actually taking quite a bit for granted. Where most practitioners, if I am like, oh yeah, they're only maybe 80th percentile openness instead of like 99th percentile openness. And maybe they're like 30th percentile neuroticism, right? Then it makes a lot more sense that yeah. So the overlays, what do you call them? You call them layering, layers.
Yeah.
It's like various things. So like openness and neuroticism are examples of like stickiness that they can have with each other. So yeah, I'm taking a lot of frictionlessness I'm rolling a lot in already.
That's possible. That's very possible. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, different people will start out with sort of different degrees of quote unquote layering. Not to inappropriately reify that idea as well. I think most people, and again, this is super overgeneralization. Most people will have, in addition to sort of misconceptualization of like inside and outside and boundaries and like kind of how the phenomenological field works. Most people will call that sort of like absolute confusions, even though that's totally wrong. I think most people will have something like relative confusions as well. Stuff about like being loved or like being accepted or can I be my real self, and these will get these will sort of those initial twists in the system will typically happen like prenatally, or very soon after birth, and so even if a person has like pretty healthy openness, like their sensory processing system is like pretty good, like they're able to kind of metabolize like the buzzing, blooming confusion without sort of flinching and like layering over it like pretty well. I think, yeah, I mean, I'm not sure where I'm going with this. I think most people will still have to do like pretty deep work, like even if they're not sort of the typical speaking non-clinically, I'm not a clinician, like sort of anxious or easily dysregulated, or I'd be like really surprised to find people who still sort of don't need to like build the entire toolkit or something like that. But there are huge individual differences between people. If someone grew up like running around the woods playing outside, like they'll probably have some weird social stuff, but also like they'll probably be pretty good at just dealing with the buzzing, blooming confusion. So there are really big differences between people for sure as well. But like if someone like didn't need like a huge swath of the toolkit, like that would be pretty surprising to me, but I'm sure they're out there. So yeah.
Yeah, I guess there's another way of describing like typical mind fallacy is something like underestimating the degree to which the default layers are just highly different between people, and like underestimating how much calibration you need to do.
Yeah, I think something like that. Yeah, I mean, I could ask you like a diagnostic question, like if you're interested, just we're just just kind of poking around. I'll just say like I think we're on the same page in a ton of ways, and it's like really awesome, really interesting. Have you had any experiences of like almost like do you think you're out of your head yet, if that makes sense? Have you had any experiences of like something untwisting in a way in which like the body opens up and like it's like, oh shit, like I wasn't paying attention to like I was navigating in sort of parameterized like contingency space as opposed to like letting the body like kind of do bottom up computation space. Like I don't know, not everybody's going to experience that so viscerally and suddenly, but like that's like a thing.
Yeah, it wasn't visceral and sudden. Psychedelic experiences helped, and then the unknotting. It's the knots are still there. There's some pretty distinct ones in, I would say, sort of the like starting at like the back of the heart and the thoracic spine all the way up to like the occiput. There's some pretty significant ones there. The ones in the front of the body, yeah, like a lot more free flowing. There were specific events. Like opening the heart of compassion is not a metaphor. Like there's like a physiological event, and it's like, oh shit. Yeah. So yeah, there seems to be a thing in yoga. They talk about Shaktipat and other things where prior to this, energy body practices don't really work for people. It's like a real struggle. And afterwards, it's just like, no, obviously, and like it becomes a very significant part of practice. Like it can't not be, because in a sense, even the ones that are more cognitive, you're still noting the way in which there's this correspondence of the energetic events in the body.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, I sometimes talk about a person sort of learning the tacitly, nebulously, but sort of learning that there's a connection between non-meaning laden sensations and sort of meaning laden, like knowing and cognition and whatever. And people have a tendency to devalue and dismiss like non-meaning laden sensation at first, but then it's like, oh shit, like that is like sort of subsidizes like the whole stack, and if you like work with that, then all sorts of good things will happen in like meaning space as well. What you might find as like you continue to advance and yeah, I apologize for being like so like, oh, I'm going to be didactic, like you can just be like fuck off. There's like two phenomenon, like or two sort of patterns that one can kind of see in like body mind space, like almost like a switchback phenomenon, where like a person's system finally realizes that it was doing something wrong, and then like sort of overcorrects and like heads off in like this other direction, and then it's like, oh crap, and then it heads off in this direction again, and so it builds up almost like this like layered like switchback thing. And so like so eventually like the meditator sort of has to like retrace that, and it's like it can be really really counterintuitive, because it's like you're like, what's going on, and then you finally sort of get something that's like working and you're going this way, and then it's like, I'm almost done, fuck yeah, and then it's like, oh shit, and then it's so if you don't remember, and of course one sort of wouldn't, that you like did this, then you keep having to like sort of refactor like your whole approach, and then you're going back this way, and you can feel it in the body. And so then the other thing is kind of similar to that, so that can just take a really long time. It's like you think you're almost done, and then you just have to like completely redo your approach, and then you think you're almost done if you completely redo your approach, and this can go on for thousands of hours. And then the other thing is like pretty similar. It's almost like a wrapping phenomenon, where there's some kind of like constraint or like knottedness like along some like axis or something in the body, and then the system is like, well, like I will fix this, and so then it sort of starts to like wrap around, almost like wrap around the pole, and this actually gets into the musculature, and the musculature keeps like tightening and tightening. Um, and then so then it's like it seems to be working because like things are getting better and better, but then like this wrapping in some weird literal way is actually taking slack out of the system. And so it's like the person is like 85% of the way there, and they're like, and they run out of slack in the system, and then suddenly they are unable to keep making value changes. And so what the person has to do is, even if they spent like 2,000 hours doing that, they have to unwrap the whole thing and like sort of like start over, without that wrapping happening. So it's like there's a knot, like person, I'm making progress, I'm making progress, I'm making progress, but then it's like then the knot pulls tight and they can't make any more progress, so they have to back up, undo the knot, and then okay, that, I mean, it's like very literal, sort of. And so so this can be like incredibly discouraging. And this is why I think up front, like getting better and better at feedback loops is like really important. So like even if a person makes egregious mistakes, like which I have, it's still like pretty doable, like on the order of like 10,000 hours, famous last words. So it's like, so it's okay to make a large number of like egregious mistakes like that. It's just like, it's okay. But also if it can be avoided, like that's amazing. And so one does that by just like really sort of upfront, like working on the feedback loops, so that like if someone is doing the wrapping thing, it's like, okay, there's like some weird, subtle, like, single pixel of like tension that seems to be increasing somewhere, and it's like that's probably a problem. Like, don't ignore that for 2,000 hours. So and there's all sorts of dynamics there where it's like even if something bad is happening, it still might take like 500 hours to like figure out how to go in the reverse direction. And then it's just like that's okay. That's okay. And again, like this is stuff that beginning meditators like sort of just shouldn't worry about because they'll go crazy. That's too much of a strong statement, but it's like when someone gets like intermediate and advanced, like I think this stuff gets really, really important. And if someone can like get the right things happening in the front end, like they might save like a lot of time. But in real time, it's still going to take like thousands of hours, I think. So
So I've had some luck with what seems like some undoing in this area with applying integration techniques to formal practice itself, right? So,
cool.
So integration is like part of the cycle, but also like it can take the cycle as object, right? It can take like your whole way of orienting towards your practice.
Good. Cool.
And it's interesting because of the ways in which it's almost like a not quite qualitative difference, but like there's some desire to peg the objections that come up while doing that kind of thing as like very different from the kinds of objections that come up with very more object level emotional tangles and I want to be this way or that. It's wrapping it back on the meta process itself. And it's almost like the same as some of the other meta constructs. So fear about fear tends to like pull the knot tighter. It's like a knot on top of a knot. Similarly here, the objections there, it might just be that, it might just interact with people's like metaphysical sort of like fear and uncertainty and like what is it? It's when it starts wrapping on itself, when you get to like the second level of meta, it's sort of like in inductions itself, like all the way up the stack, right? I think it makes people feel it brings them uncomfortably close to void or source, whatever you want to call it, and the groundlessness of that becomes more apparent, and that generates like a flinch and a fear reaction.
Yeah, I think that's right. I like, I think the system is very reasonably sort of protecting itself against dysregulation, and I think the conservativeness of the system is like ultimately like a very positive thing. It's like, and I tell people that they, if something is dysregulating, like, just don't do it, and then like all things being equal, and then at some point the system will figure out how to do that thing like within sort of almost like an equanimity cradle or like a structural cradle that allows them to like do whatever that thing was, but without dysregulation. So it's like, you know, over and over again, the system like makes it safe to look, and then the system can look, makes it safe to enter like a particular substate, enters that particular substate. And so like this is sort of where the breadth first thing can come in handy, because uh, the depth first thing can cause like a lot of unpredictable things to happen to the system that spends like hundreds of hours cleaning it up, and also like doesn't have good wayfinding set up, so that you might kind of start flail for a very long time or forever, never make it to X. But if one has like good habits of like making it safe to look, then look, making it safe to do, then doing, or whatever, uh, that sort of scale free, and fractal. And so, so the system, learns how to sort of globally navigate in a way that with non-monotonicities, like there will still be some dysregulation, still be some, hopefully not, like possibly some muscle tension, still be some like freakouts. But, the system learns how to prepare the ground, whether that takes like a month or 2 years or whatever, and then to like sort of go into the ground, work the ground or something. And then you just sort of do that like over and over and over again. And then maybe like the other piece of that is like in my system, there's like the main practices, then there's the meta practice, then there is a meta practice, and then that's it. Once you sort of get to like meta, you have to like sort of set the pieces up, and then surrender, and the system sort of spontaneously kind of collapses and does what it needs to do. So of course there's you have to balance top down and bottom up. You have to balance doing and surrender and letting go. So yeah.
Yeah, I guess the reason I think I'm less bearish on the structured nature of like going with a more traditional cycle is that, at least properly construed, and maybe this doesn't work for most people unless they're in conversation with like multiple people and able to sort of triangulate. But each node seems sort of holographic and meta in the sense that each one can take the others in itself as they're sufficiently flexible, they can take the others as object, right? So integration can step back and look at sort of the whole thing. Insight can also sort of step back a little bit and look at the whole thing. And concentration is, at least once you're past certain posts on the way you think about concentration, it's both fabrication and unfabricating are both involved in the practice, and there's the dialectic between those, and that generates this whole thing that's part of the insights for them. But they don't feel stuck in a way of like incapable of like freely floating in terms of the levels of abstraction.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'll sort of have certain biases given my own kind of path dependence or the path that I took. It's my like over and over again, I've had the experience of like, being like, yes, this is working. This is going to go all the way. And it seems like that's happening, for 500 to like 2000 hours. And then at least in the beginning, sort of hitting a wall, like at full speed, eventually hitting the wall at much slower speeds. Yeah, it just, based on what you're saying, I could imagine like sort of running out of slack and like hitting a wall or something. Or like I'm wrong. And there was something weird and contingent about my system that is causing me to say the things that I'm saying.
Well, so people who are more into shikantaza as a primary practice have said that they really like the idea of having all of the sort of, so you can jump back, you can step out of a cycle and see all the sort of cycle views as a way of construing practice, right? It's like you get these little cycles going that are like coherent structures that like direct your practice and experience and stuff, and then have that whole thing in an epicycle of in a dialectic with the more deconstructive thing. And that sounds like it might more easily encompass what you're talking about.
Maybe. Yeah. So noting shikantaza, practices that are both extremely simple and extremely general. I think there's potentially some survivorship bias where some subset of people like don't make it, but I think those practices are more likely to produce successes than more structured stuff. So I could imagine that, again, maybe with survivorship bias, like noting shikantaza can get away with like sort of more chillness about certain kinds of things. I don't know if that's like quite speaking to your point, but what you're saying, I can't sort of fully like grasp the thing you're saying, but the gist of it is plausible to me. And
Yeah,
I might.
it's almost like, it's kind of like the adding the second level of meta thing.
Okay, I believe
it's
it.
like once you have n+1, like you can swap in any n and it's fine, right? Like in a certain sense, although deep high n tends to get weird and silly because it's not actually something that we do natively.
I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying. Like, so yeah, there's ways in which the idea of meta kind of breaks down because there's it's conceptual. But I agree with something in the space of like, once someone learns to kind of step back all the way, there will be something like contingent about that, but the system can eventually generalize and eventually learn how to omni go meta as needed or something. And maybe we're kind of talking about the same thing.
Yeah, maybe I would say noticing that the act of stepping back is sort of scale free, and like not and like dropping the assumption that because you've taken several steps back in the way that whatever system says you're supposed to, that means that you're like fully stepped back.
Yeah.
Like once that's dropped, then it's like, oh right, I can just sort of like back up from anything that I'm working with.
Yeah, that seems good. Yeah, I had one more thought in there somewhere. Maybe that suffices. Yeah, I was just gonna say like that fully stepping back, or even dropping this idea of being able to fully step back, like something in there. There's still a way in which that will probably have like errors in it, but that'll get a person to a particular place, and eventually they'll be able to go in and like correct those errors. So this is just like, not to like inappropriately reify this idea of stepping back or letting go of stepping back. Like there'll be something weird about how the person is doing it that will eventually need to get corrected. But yeah, but something in there is like quite resonant.
Yeah.
Well, my general background impression of you from before having any conversation with you is that you're very good at like hill climbing literature. So it's like, if there is a body of literature and there's like a reasonable sort of distance metric across that literature, it's like you, Romeo, are going to find your way to the best material. And I've had that impression of you for a long time. And I think there's like so much correct in the approach you're taking, and it's like quite novel. There's no one doing what you're doing or succeeding in quite the way that you're succeeding. You're like also like, I haven't had a lot of contact with kind of people that you might be slightly more adjacent to. So like, maybe like the way you're headed is like super correlated with the way other people are headed. I just haven't run into them. But I think you're doing something special, like with the a lot of the distinctions that you're making around path like versus method versus like outcome versus I think no one out there is like detangling things in quite the way that you are. And that's kind of why like in this call I've been sort of like hitting so hard or whatever, or like really trying to make the points that I was making, because I haven't found a way to make those points to a lot of other people yet, and I could be wrong. This is my position at the moment where I'm standing in terms of sort of positive or constructive like scrupulosity or precision. And so like that was like kind of the axe that I was grinding in this call, like kind of the point that I was trying to make. Because I think that you'll be able to sort of find the distinctions in the things that I'm saying where like a lot of other people wouldn't, at least at first, maybe, I don't know.
And then another thing was something like, do you have any guesses, or have you encountered before? Maybe, I don't know. Like reifying it in this way is also like a thing, obviously. But yeah, the sort of the more dense, less transparent, like energy in the sort of back of the head, back of the neck, that whole like thing, the traditional, a sort of traditional locus of identification. How do you poke at that sort of thing?
Yeah, great. Okay. So first pass, something like maximum indirectness or obliquity. So like,
maximum indirectness. You mean just ignoring it?
No. I think it's still yeah, it's still
Yeah.
okay. So whatever maximum means, I think it still can be quite deliberate. Although one does have to like let go of it over and over again to only come back to it later. So like there definitely is like needs to be like a willingness to drop it. There's almost like a if I'm reading this right, like there's almost like a compaction that occurs. So like there's like that switchback thing, but instead of like sort of a loose switchback, it's like compacted. And that can be sort of like felt in the musculature. It's just like very, very dense. There'll be like subtle tension in the system. And so it can take a long time to sort of be able to tell that something's changing, like because of that density. Or it'll sort of be like taking like just like microns like off the top, so it's really hard to tell that something's changing because there's just such a mass. But the way that one can sort of work with this is by kind of creating more and more slack in the system, where it's like if um if there's like a place for that tension to go, or if there's a place for that density to go, there is like, loosely speaking, leaky abstraction, like there is a little bit of like a mass flow analogy. So one of the things that I tell people is like, especially if they are in some kind of problematic regime where like muscle tension is increasing and they sort of like can't do anything about it, um, uh, there's a tendency to like focus on the muscle tension. But another thing a person can do is, say the muscle tension is like in their chest. Well, then, pay attention to the tips of your fingers or like the bottoms of your feet. And that's kind of what I mean about the indirectness thing. If the thing that a person is doing isn't working, or like whatever they're doing is like making something worse, then, you know, instead of, sometimes the right thing to do is to like go into the weeds and like sort of be intricate with like tweezers in the thing that's problematic. And sometimes the right thing to do is to like go like way somewhere else. And sometimes that'll be sort of spatial and sometimes that'll sort of be in method. But like, because of something like finitude, where, the system is not infinite, the system is finite. And so like, similarly to like, if you touch the right wall of a maze and keep walking while maintaining contact with the wall, you'll eventually get out of the maze. In a similar way, like, if, as long as someone is doing something very leakily, abstractly, analogously, like keep putting their hand on the wall, if they keep going in the right ways, like eventually, whatever knots or tangles there are, like those knots or tangles will undo. If they've sort of pre-committed to some kind of like gentle like exhaustivity, or perfection, or everythingness. So when something isn't working over here, you sort of just go do something else. And then, then there's, so this is kind of the wayfinding thing. Like, one will eventually have experiences of something like nothing left to do here, where here is some spot in some high dimensional space, or it's more like nothing left to do here right now. And that's almost like, you almost get to like put like a marker there, like a breadcrumb, and then that unless enough things change elsewhere, it's like you don't have to come back to where you left the breadcrumb. And eventually, like, you've left breadcrumbs like over like a very large surface area. And so then if there's like this weird density stuff over here that is like not changing, then that instead of like messing with that, you go out into like the field and you look for places where there aren't breadcrumbs. And that's what I mean sort of of like indirectness or obliquity. And it's like eventually it's like, you know, there's like breadcrumbs everywhere, and there's like this like little hole where there's not a breadcrumb, and it's like, okay, now I can either like mess with this dense stuff that's not changing, which sometimes you find like a new surface, a new opening, or like you go through this hole, and then it's like, oh shit, like this is another 2,000 hours over here that I didn't even know was there. And then you do that, and then this like weird dense thing, because of like these like long distance all connections that are like opaque, like eventually starts to like to move. So this is sort of an analogy for like global wayfinding. Yeah, if some things like locked up, like sometimes you just go somewhere else, and then eventually this thing will unlock. So okay, there's an answer.
Yeah, that's helpful. Also, it makes me think seems like there's significant overlap between what you talk about as slack and sort of
Yes.
equanimity, and but also it seems like you're rolling in what I would call like what other schools would sort of like reify more, and you're sort of just like leaving it more amorphous. So lack of personality view, craving non-dual spaciousness, like maybe jhana factors a little bit. So a lot of that sort of like being gestured at with in a way that's like they don't have to go together in any certain way.
You lost me. I think, could you just say it in a different way, or just say it again?
Yeah, so the way, so I don't actually know that this is true. This is a guess,
Yeah,
and I was seeing how you're reacting.
Yeah.
The way that you were talking about Slack sort of pinged different parts, like it cut in on
Okay.
instead of like being a single thing.
Yeah. I'm using it in a, well, I think it's a very, I think I'm using it specifically, but its service manifestations can be very, very different. There's elements of like Shinzen Young's flow. There's elements of what's like pitta.
PT?
PT. There's elements of that. There's some stuff in the jhanic space. It's like you know, if the system is moving, or particular sort of shimmery qualities are in evidence, or there's like somatic refactoring going on, you know, that means that there has to have been slack, otherwise those changes like would not sort of have space to occur. So it's like, yeah, so it's just so if the system is making changes in a direction, very loosely speaking, and then changes in that direction are no longer available, then the system has run out of slack, like along that micro dimension in that micro region. And then sometimes one would want to perform operations that will like free up more slack, and then those changes can continue. But most of the time, that there's any slack being pulled tight at all, like usually means in that region or whatever, something has gone wrong, like way upstream, because typically, ideally, one would sort of not be encountering the experience of running out of slack at all. So it usually means like something weird is going on way upstream that's producing the running out of slack phenomenon in the first place. But yeah, I mean, like if, you know, to go back to kind of like the flywheel thing, like if things are changing and then like somewhat suddenly like that the flywheel stops, then slack has been run out. And again, like, you know, there's particular sort of pushing momentum that can kind of get like layered over or like stuck, that eventually then the person has to kind of like figure out how to like make that like pushing momentum kind of like stop. I'm trying to push in like too many points and concepts and whatever, but maybe I'll come back to that.
So I'm also hearing a lot of overlap with what I think Robert Bea usually refers to as this is another dimension of it rather than being the thing. States of relative spaciousness.
Yeah, could be. That's evocative.
And then the other thing that came up was it sounds like you are trying to say in several different ways, like pointing out the different ways of like writing the bottom line first. It's happening like all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that's actually a pretty general way to talk about fabrication.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't actually think of that before. But yeah, I do find it sort of interesting and surprising how often that comes up, both in myself and in others. And I guess it actually makes sense in a predictive coding context. I hadn't thought of that either. That's interesting. Of course, it would come up a lot. We're like built to do it. So yeah, it might just be that it would be handy to have more handles for that chunk of concept space to be able to cut in more areas. But yeah, no. So anyway, object level, the density stuff, that's helpful. Is there a specific thing about that? Compactness, Slack. I think what it points out for me is that I shouldn't necessarily have any particular view about it. That is a subtle writing the bottom line first on my part. If I have the story that it's a obstacle to practice, or that it's not supposed to be occurring this way, or that it should be opening up in the way that some chakra manual says, or whatever it is, that all of that is potentially maybe useful, but also potentially a hindrance if tightened around. Yeah, it's one of those things that like no matter how much we practice, we can always accidentally tighten around something, and then someone will be like, wait a minute, that's not quite.
It's like if someone is like, man, I really want to like open my heart chakra, or like I really want to open this particular channel, and they're like trying to get it open, I'm just like, oh no, like do something else somewhere else in this system, otherwise they're just layering more and more and more on top of it sometimes. So yeah, I think of like a Tower of Hanoi problem, where sometimes you have to go backwards to go forwards. Constraint-based updating system, where sometimes you have to like backchain way far away in order to like undo a thing that allows you to undo moving forward. So meditation for me is very much like puzzle solving, and very much,
yeah. The thing that you mentioned actually made me think of the way you're talking about Slack. The visual that I get from it is sort of like you're on a leash, and the leash is like not like tied to a single point. It's like tangled among a bunch of nails.
That's right.
And you're like, I can go this much in this direction, but wait, okay, maybe I need to like go back and like pull out some nails. And
that's right.
Maybe some of them are really like dug in there because it's like pulled so tight around them, and you're like, okay, well, I'm gonna go do some other ones.
That's right. Yeah, and it's like water's trying to flow, and then there's like lots of like leaves like tangled up with like the lead that's running through the nails, and then like once you untangle the thing, then like the leaves kind of like rush through, and then the water flows, and the water is like just free flowing like sensory information going through the system. Like water is flowing through the tubes, and then the flowing of the water through the tubes like sculpts the tubes, and then it's like, so like once you sort of like unblock like all the things, like the system is sort of fully structurally fluid, like all the channels are open, and then and then that sort of maximal kind of adaptiveness to environment, something like under contingency. Like it's still possible for things to happen, too fast, too suddenly, too intensely, too surprisingly. So it's like, I think there's some way in which, all things being equal, like there's certain kinds of ways that well, I'll just leave it there. Like there's a cool thing that happens. I think it's anyway. Okay. I'm trying to do too much at once here. So I'll just words have been said.
No, it's harder when it's very wide ranging, and if we're trying to bounce a lot across multiple levels of abstraction at once. Yeah.
Appreciate that. Yeah.
But it's fun. I enjoy it. Agreed. At least.
Agreed. Yeah. Great.
Yeah. Anything else dangling? Feels unfinished, or?
I don't think so. Yeah, it's been really good talking to you, and like if we talk again, like I'll adapt and we'll rein it in a little bit, or we'll have like we will improve, adapt, overcome, and yeah, no other thoughts right now, although I'm sure I'll have some as soon as we end.
All right.
Are you in the mood now? I'm sorry, I'm so like, I feel very very promotion focused. Like, do you have any thoughts about the video? Like, there's worlds where we just put the whole thing online. There's worlds where I like only put my part online. There's worlds where
you can use whatever for whatever
okay.
in whatever way. If you like do a super cut of me into like saying like Mark is the greatest, and then maybe I'll have an objection. But other than that, like
okay.
yeah.
So if I put just put this raw uncut online, like that would be okay with you?
Yeah.
Okay, that's
Or
I
edited in whatever way. Yeah,
yeah.
I don't predict that it would be a problem.
Okay. I feel like that's very generous. I'll however I sort of label it or annotate it, I'll check with you first. I feel like that's very generous. Thank you very much.
Yeah, of course.
I'm gonna hopefully help a lot of people. And I'd love to talk again.
Yeah, I'll catch you online.
All right, sounds great. I'll talk to you later.